Welcome to the Dynamic CRM 2011 Creating Workflows workshop. This course will cover the options and functionality you have when creating workflows within Dynamic CRM. The agenda for the workshop is to discuss why workflows are important for business processes. Then we will look at the differences between workflows and dialogues to see when you would use one over the other. Then we'll take a look in detail at the options you have when creating workflows. Business processes are an important part of a solution. Being able to automate and control the flow of the process is key for user adoption and making sure the right information is getting into the system and is being updated in the system. Dynamic CRM has two types of processes. We have automated processes that are based on actions or results of working in the system, and we have interactive processes that are initiated and run by the end user. Automated processes consist of workflow, custom workflow activities, and plugins. Interactive processes consist of dialogues. Looking at the differences between workflows and dialogues. Workflows can be started by an end user or can be automatically triggered. Workflows are asynchronous processes and do not require user input to run to completion. These processes will run in the background. When a workflow is triggered, a record is created on the async operations base table, and the asynchronous service will pick up that request and process that workflow. Both Windows Workflow Foundation 4 and 3.5 custom activities are supported. Workflows that are created or updated outside of Microsoft Dynamics CRM by creating and updating the underlying XAML files are supported. Now looking at dialogues. Dialogues are started by an end user. They need user action to continue processing the dialogue and need user action to complete the dialogue. Dialogues are synchronous processes that require user action to complete. When you run these processes, a wizard-like interface is presented to you so you can take appropriate actions to run the process. The entity that stores information generated by running the dialogue is the process session entity, and only Workflow Foundation 4 custom activities are supported. And then dialogues that are created outside or updated outside by trying to update the XAML file are not supported in Dynamic CRM. So looking a little more at the workflow entity, Dynamic CRM gives you the ability to have end users create workflows if you give them the permissions. You can create child workflows that can be used to trigger sub-processes to run. Dynamic values gives you the ability to input data from CRM into your processes. Stages can be used to allow you to group your workflow steps into sections, so the second section can't start until the first section is completed. Workflow is an entity in the system, so you can use advanced find or other reporting methods if you would like to see the number of workflows completed, run any type of queries or views on those workflow processes. Those are all available within the system. There are 5 main ways a workflow is triggered. A workflow can be triggered on record creation. So example, an email is sent to a queue. The queue could fire a workflow, or if a new opportunity is created, that could fire a workflow. When a record status changes is another way to trigger a workflow. So if I were to close an opportunity, deactivate an account, those types of status changes would trigger the workflow. When a record is assigned, so if I assign a record to another user within the system, that can trigger a workflow. It can also trigger workflow on any change to a field within that entity. So we can select certain fields we want to trigger workflows off of, and then based on that change can trigger that workflow. And then when a record is deleted, we can also fire a workflow when a record is deleted in the system. When creating workflows, it's important to keep in mind the workflow context, because workflows can be automatically triggered or triggered on demand. So depending on how they are triggered determines the context that workflow is run in. So for example, automatic workflows, they will run under the context of the owning user. So I as a system admin or a customizer go in and I create some workflows. And if I'm the owner of those workflows, when they're automatically triggered, those workflows will run under my context. As long as I have permissions to, let's just say my workflow is going to create an account. As long as my permissions have access to create accounts, then that workflow will complete successfully. However, an on-demand workflow runs under the user context, so that user would then need permissions to create accounts in order for that workflow to complete successfully. When you have a parent workflow that triggers a child workflow, Similar context comes into play. If that workflow is triggered automatically, then the child workflow that it triggers will also be run under the context of the owner of the workflow. Again, and then if it's an on-demand workflow that triggers, and then that one triggers an on-demand child workflow, then that will be run under the context of the user that initially triggered it. So it's important to keep in mind the context, because you could run into scenarios where users may not have certain permissions that the workflow would need to complete. So keeping in mind whether you want on-demand or automatic workflows, and then the permissions that users have. When creating workflows, it's important to keep in mind the workflow scope as well. Each automatic workflow can be configured to have scope values like user, business unit, parent-child, or organization. Now, depending on the scope will determine which users in the system can trigger the workflows. So by selecting user as the scope, only records owned by the current user that is owning that workflow are affected by the process. Even if the user has organizational level access and can update other records, the workflow will not trigger because he does not own those records. By selecting business unit as the scope, the workflow will only execute for the users within the workflow owner's business unit. Selecting parent-child business unit as the scope will execute for users in the user's business unit and records with ownership in a child business unit of the workflow owner's business unit. And then the last option, by selecting organization as the scope, the workflow will execute on any record in the organization, no matter what security roles and rights the user has. As long as they trigger the workflow, it'll run as long as it's set to organization. For on-demand workflows, the scope is a little bit different there. So on-demand workflows basically are based off of the security role permissions that user has. If the trigger point is on demand, then the workflow scope is directly related to the current user's workflow read rights on the security record. So if it's set to organization, then the workflow will be selectable in the run workflow option for all users that have organizational read rights to the workflow permission. If it is set to business unit scope, then it will be selectable only if the workflow is owned by someone in your business unit. And then the other option is if it's a scope of user, only the owner of that workflow would be able to see that on-demand workflow in their list to be able to run that on demand. So here's a list of the workflow privileges. So the process entity is what we were just talking about. As long as the users have permissions on this entity to read at an organizational level, they would see all on-demand workflows. If it was set to business unit, it would only see the on-demand workflows within their business unit. These permissions also give them the access to create workflows, delete, assign, share, etc. So you can control the permissions of how much you want your users to be able to access as far as creating workflows and then reading on-demand workflows and being able to trigger them. The system job entity, that allows them to see when a workflow is triggered, it creates a system job, and they can actually see then the process that happened. If it's in a waiting state, is it completed? They can see that information by having access to the system jobs. And then the execute workflow job privilege allows users to actually execute an on-demand workflow. So they basically need to have this permission in order to execute a workflow. Some additional privileges around sharing and assigning. So if I share a workflow to another user, that user would then be able to run that workflow on demand, as long as it was set to an on-demand workflow, regardless of the scope that was set for that workflow. So that'd be one way. If you want another user to test out your on-demand workflow, you could share it with them, and then they should be able to run that workflow. Assigning a workflow gives ownership to the other person and allows them to then disable and enable that workflow should they need to. Organizational level permissions, you can deactivate all workflows and modify all workflows as long as you have the organizational level privileges on that processes entity. However, the key thing to note here is you cannot activate workflows unless you're the actual owner of the workflow. So you can't modify a workflow to send an email to someone else and then publish it under their user account, because they would need to actually activate that workflow so they can see kind of what workflows are running under their context. Let's switch over to the demo to take a look at creating these workflows. So in the demo here, we're going to go ahead and go down to settings, and we'll go to processes, And we'll go ahead and create a new process. I'm going to go ahead and create a sales process as an example. And it'll be based off the opportunity entities. You see here we have a list of all the entities within the system, including custom ones. And we can choose whether we want to create a dialogue or a workflow. So for this course, we'll do the workflow. And when the workflow editor comes up, here you'll see some of the options we talked about during the slides. We see the option to make an on-demand workflow or a child workflow. So those are a couple options there. And then as we come over to the right-hand side here we have that scope that we talked about. So do we want the scope to be user, business unit, parent-child, or organization? So in this case, I want organization because I want any user in the system that creates an opportunity that this will trigger the workflow for them. And then I'm going to have the workflow triggered when the record is created. Here you can see the other options that we talked about as well. If I were to select the fields option here, I can then come in here and select all the fields that I want to be able to trigger the workflow on. So maybe if I had a sales stage updated, maybe I want to trigger workflow on that sales stage update. So there's some examples there that we could do as well. But for this example, we'll just go ahead and when a record is created, and then I'm going to come down here to the steps. So let's go ahead and add a step. Within the workflows, we have options for different check conditions. So we can have a check condition to check to make sure that a value on that opportunity is maybe it's a certain amount or it's at a certain status before we actually run the workflow and trigger certain actions with the workflow. But in this instance, I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and create a record. So when an opportunity is created, we want to create a follow-up phone call activity to follow up with this opportunity. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the create option. I'm going to choose phone call, and then we'll go ahead and hit set properties. On the set properties window here, this is where you can go ahead and fill in a bunch of dynamic values. So dynamic values really gives you the capabilities to plug in many different values within the system into this record. So I could go, for example, the sender of this phone call. So the person that's going to make the phone call will be the owner of the opportunity. So if I pull up the opportunity entity and I come in here and I find the owner field, I can dynamically insert that. And so whoever that opportunity owner is will be the sender of that phone call, or the one that will actually make the phone call. And then again, I can come down here and actually make the owner the same as well. So the owner of the phone call will also be the owner of the phone call activity. The recipient, so maybe we want to make sure that we default in the recipient. So again, we can pull in values from either the opportunity, or this opportunity is going to be tied to an account. So we can actually pick the account entity and then come over here and find maybe the primary contact for that account. So we actually want to call that customer. And then you can default stuff into the subject as well, or you can hard code some stuff. So say follow up with, let's go ahead and default in the subject or the topic of the opportunity. And for some reason, if a field could be blank and then wouldn't default anything in, you can put in default value, so that can be used instead of the blank value that may find if there isn't a value for one of your dynamic fields. And then as far as the due date, we can come in here and we can actually use some operators to say we want this to be due 7 days after the opportunity created on date. So we can dynamically set the date that will show up as a due date for the owner of this phone call activity. Okay, so now I'm going to save and close this. And then you can also type descriptions on your workflow steps. So this kind of helps when you're actually looking at the workflows. When the workflows are triggered and you're looking at them after, like in the system job or on the entity, you can quickly see what that step in your workflow is doing. So using names that make sense allows a little bit easier troubleshooting if you need to figure out why a step isn't completing or what that step should be doing. So once I have this phone call created, what I want to do is I want to wait for this phone call to be created before I move on with anything else within this workflow. So we have the ability to insert a wait condition. So I'm going to go ahead and insert the wait condition. I'm just going to say, wait for phone call completion. And then you can go ahead and put in your condition here. So we're just going to say wait until, and we're going to go ahead and pick the phone call. So as you see here, the first step I named create phone call follow-up. This is also where the naming is key, so you can know which steps you can reference later on within your workflow. But I'm going to go ahead and pick this phone call. So we actually have access to that phone call activity now. I'm going to say when that phone call status equals, and then I'll say completed. Click OK. Let's save and close. And then we can go ahead and select the step right below it. So we can say once that phone call activity is completed, then we want to do another action. So we can maybe want to sign the record to someone else, send an email to someone. But in this case, since it's kind of more of a sales stage workflow that we're setting up, I'm just going to create a task record, and then I'm going to hit set properties. Same thing again. You can fill out the dynamic values here. Maybe this is the 30-day follow-up. You can say due date 1 month after phone call actual end. So now we can actually get our phone call activity we created. The actual end of that is the due date. Because we'll know that that phone call is completed because it needs to be completed before we can get to this step. So I'll just go ahead and say that for now. And then again, you can continue on with your workflow. We'll do another check condition here. So after that task is created, maybe we want to do a check condition to check the value of this opportunity. So if opportunity estimated revenue, is less than or equal to, let's do 100,000, then we want to assign this opportunity to one of our salesperson. So I'll pick Ben here. So select new, basically owner will equal Ben. So I'll go ahead and close that. And then what I can do is I can continue on where, obviously the opportunity could be greater than 100,000 as well. So if I select that if statement and click add step, I can add a conditional branch. So conditional branch kind of gives me that else, if it's not this, otherwise do this step. So we'll do otherwise if the opportunity estimated revenue is greater than or equal to, let's do 101,000, then go ahead and do this step, which then we'll assign it to someone else. We'll pick Chris here. So as you can see, you can continue on with the if steps, otherwise, and you can continue on with the otherwise. There isn't really a limitation there. If you start to nest some of your if statements, so if I had an if here and then I nested it under here, there is a limit to 5 nested statements, but as long as they're in the same level like these two are, you could have many if statements to check different conditions. So I could do is greater than or equal to 1,000, is between 1,000 and 2,000, 3,000 and 4,000, and so on. So, and then the other option is there's a default action. So default action basically kind of ends the if statement saying if it's not this and it's not this, then go ahead and do this step. In my case, it would not match one of the 2 steps above, but just for the demo here, I just want to kind of show that then you can, maybe we wanted to assign this record. If it for some reason didn't match one of those 2 up there, then we can actually come in here and let's just say we'll assign it to Nancy. And so that would basically kind of end that if statement saying if it's not these 2, then do this 3rd step. So we can go ahead and we can save that workflow and we can go ahead and activate it, and that will make that workflow available within the system. So anytime a new opportunity is created, now you'll see a workflow get fired. So let's just go ahead and take a quick look at that. Go to opportunities, create a new opportunity, and let's go ahead and save. And I'll go ahead and fill in estimated revenue here too. So that is in there. So as a way for that workflow to kick off, one way, like we mentioned, to view the workflows is by clicking on the workflow on the left-hand side here. You can see any workflow that is triggered. So as you can see, the workflow that I submitted off hasn't created the system job yet. Once that system job's created, it'll show up in this list. Now I hit refresh, and now that system job has come up. and you see it is in a waiting state. So maybe I want to check out why is it in a waiting state. So I can go ahead and double click on it. That'll open up the workflow, kind of the process. You can see that it went through and it created our phone call, and now it actually is in our waiting state, waiting for that phone call to be completed. The other thing nice too with this view is you can actually come in here and click on the actual link, because it actually links you to the call it created. And so here I can actually pull up that activity, and I can see it looks like it pulled the sender in. It didn't pull the recipient because I didn't have an account with my primary contact wasn't on the account. So that might be a good example of needing a default value in there. Then you can see it scheduled it for a week out from today. Let's fill this in quick. And we'll mark complete. And now once that's completed, I'm going to close it, we should see this workflow continue on. So I'll refresh it, and you can see the workflow completed. It went through, it created the task, it saw that the revenue was less than 100,000, and then assigned it to Ben. So if we come back out here, let's go ahead and close this. Go back to activities. You'll see we now have that 30-day follow-up activity, as well as the completed activity that we have completed already. And if we go back to general here, and I'm just going to hit F5 to refresh my screen, we should see the owner of it now is Ben. So you see Ben down here is now on it, and then the workflow handled all of that automation. So back at the workflow, we go ahead and open this workflow up again. In order to modify it, we'll have to deactivate it. Click OK. Make the screen a little bigger here. And then as the workflow gets kind of long, you can actually collapse the process properties up here, and you get a little more real estate to work with. But as you want to make changes to workflow, there isn't really an easy way to just kind of drag and move things around. But what you can do is if you select a certain step, there is options to insert before and after. So you can try to add steps within the middle. So maybe you wanted to update the record or create another record once that opportunity is created. You can definitely do that as well. So maybe we want to create a task. We can get that inserted into there. A few other steps that we haven't talked about yet as we look through this. We looked at the check conditions and the conditional branch and default action. But stage, you can add a stage to your workflow. Once you add a stage though, you have to group everything within the stages. So stage 1 would have a certain set of actions. Stage 2 would then happen after stage 1 completes. As we move down here, we use the wait condition, but you could have you could have a parallel wait, where you could have waiting on two different things to happen, and then depending on those, the results could trigger the next steps within the workflow. Create record, update, assign, send, those are pretty self-explanatory. Start child workflow. So this is where you'd be able to come, once you hit this step in your workflow, it can then trigger a child workflow to go do a sub-process. So maybe you have 3 or 4 workflows that all eventually have the same sub-process to run or to kick off. A good point there would be then to create that sub-process as one child workflow, and then just call that from your other workflows. That way you have less workflows to manage and update should you need to update it later on. Change status. So this allows you to change the state of a record. So for example, an opportunity, maybe if you set the sales stage to complete, a workflow could trigger to close or mark that opportunity as won or lost, or depending on your workflow. So there's some options there with the change state or change status. And then the other one is stop workflow. So if you have an example where you have some conditions, and if it meets a certain condition, you just want to end the workflow, you don't want it to continue processing at all, that would be an example of using a stop workflow. You just want the workflow to stop, and then that'll complete. So I hope this gave you a base understanding of the different options within the workflow editor. There's many different options and scenarios that you can come up with to automate your business processes that will really help drive user adoption. Being able to monitor the workflows is important. There are 2 ways in Dynamics CRM to monitor your workflows. System jobs gives you an overview of all the system jobs that are running in the system. So you can query on your workflows and see which ones are in a waiting state, which ones have completed, which ones are in a pending state, error, and so forth. You can set up different views, queries in order to get that information. Another way is to look at each record. So if I have a workflow that triggers on the creation of an opportunity, I can go to that opportunity record, click on the workflow tab, and see all the workflows that have been triggered on that opportunity, as well as drill into each workflow and see what steps that workflow has completed. And maybe if it's in a waiting state, then I could see what step it is waiting on, or I can see that the workflow is completed or it failed on a certain step. So it kind of helps me in troubleshooting as well. To export and import workflows, basically moving workflows between organizations, we need to use solutions. So if you're not familiar with creating solutions in Dynamics CRM, you want to at least learn the basics on being able to add your workflows to a solution and then export them out as unmanaged or managed, depending on your case. Once they're in a solution, then they can be easily ported over to another organization and imported. And so all your workflows can be migrated from a dev environment to a test to production, or from one customer environment to another. The one limitation or one key thing to keep in mind is if you have workflows that you hard code values, so like you have a record being assigned to a certain user and you actually have that user hard coded in your workflow, that workflow step would need to be updated when it's imported into the new system, because the user GUID and that user would be different in the new system. And so you need to make sure that all those kind of hard-coded values are updated before you continue on your workflow. You won't be able to activate it until those are updated. And I want to thank you for watching today's workshop and hope you found the information valuable. Thank you.